In 2017, Destiny 2 was on the verge of collapse. Players were quitting in droves, and many of them would never return. This brand new game felt like a downgrade compared to Destiny 1, with several core features being either simplified or outright removed. With all of that in mind, this video is taking a look back at what Destiny 2 was really like in the early days. This was a rough period for the game, and it is almost completely unrecognizable compared to what we have today. When Destiny 1 players first loaded into Destiny 2, one of the most glaring issues was the complete rework to the weapon system. Today, your top two slots can have both primary and special weapons, but in 2017, we were forced to always use two primary weapons. Special ammo did not exist, and everything that wasn't a primary went into the heavy slot. Even stuff like snipers and shotguns were forced to use heavy ammo, and they often had a difficult time competing with rocket launchers and more traditional heavies. In retrospect, looking at gameplay from 2017, it is extremely strange because it involves like 99% primary usage. Abilities like grenades were rarely ever activated because they had long cooldowns, there was almost no build crafting whatsoever, and the ammo system meant that heavies could only be used occasionally for big enemies. The result was that the gameplay mostly involved continuously firing your primary weapons forever until the target was finally defeated. The ammo brick system was also extremely weird because there were white bricks for primary, green for energy, and purple for power. There was no such thing as unlimited primary ammo like we have today, so instead we had to rely on green and white bricks to fuel our two main weapons. This might have made the game more balanced from a competitive PvP perspective, but the overall change was absolutely despised by the vast majority of the community. It just had such a negative impact on gameplay, and it was cited as a reason for many people hating vanilla Destiny 2. These problems weren't the only contentious things about the weapon system though. Random rolls were a defining feature of Destiny 1, but D2 proceeded to instead launch with static rolls where every single weapon was the same. For example, every drop of the Better Devil's hand cannon was identical, so once you got it, every subsequent drop was a meaningless duplicate. The perk system itself was also insanely simplistic and it lacked any kind of depth. Better Devils came with 3 fixed scopes, 2 fixed magazines, and the only real perk that it could ever have was explosive payload. There was no such thing as a weapon that had more than one perk. The lack of perks made legendaries feel like blues, and the overall loot chase was almost non-existent. Once you had gotten every weapon to drop, there was no reason to go get any more duplicates. You were just done. You had beaten the game. We did learn that there would be some sort of forge coming in Curse of Osiris, and we hoped that it might be similar to weapon crafting, but unfortunately this still featured static rolls. The only real improvement that we saw before the end of 2017 was that some weapons now had 2 perks to choose from instead of just 1. As you can see, players could choose between Opening Shot or Rampage on this DFA, but the core of the issue remained. There was simply no reason to get more than 1 copy of any given item in the entire game. Destiny needed to change, and the same can be said about your bulky conventional wallet. Exter has completely reimagined the wallet with their super slim design that can still hold up to 12 cards in addition to cash. One of my favorite features is that you can just press this button right here and all of your cards will come out the top. You can then simply select whichever one you need, and this makes them extremely easy and convenient to access. It also has RFID blocking to keep your cards safe, it has extra pockets and a place for cash inside, and they're all made of premium leather or space grade aluminum. If that wasn't enough already, you can also get a tracker card and put it in the back of the wallet, meaning that you can never lose it and you can always track it thanks to apps like Apple Find My. Exter is currently running a summer sale for 25% off, but you can also stack my code SDestiny2 on top of that for a total of 30% off. Head to the link in the description right now to check these out. These wallets are amazing, and I'm happy to say this is my new daily driver. Weapon mods were also insultingly basic and essentially did nothing. There were 3 blue damage type mods for each of the elements, and these could be used to change the damage type of any energy or power weapon. So if you wanted to switch your Uriel's Gift from Arc to Void, you could do that by just equipping one of these mods. Strangely enough, these damage mods were actually the only mods, and compared to what we have today, these had very little impact on your gameplay. To make matters worse, these were also consumables, so when you equipped the mod, it would disappear from your inventory. Not only was this extremely annoying and restrictive, but it also meant that players were forced to stockpile huge amounts of mods in their inventory, and it would often become overflowed and force items to the postmaster. In addition to the rare mods, there were also legendary versions that would increase the item's power level by 5. There was a legendary kinetic mod that would give the +5 bump, but that was literally the only mod that you had for kinetics, and they all felt extremely meaningless. Another shortcoming was the complete absence of catalysts, and there were also 0 masterworks for your weapons or armor. In an effort to improve the non-existent loot chase, Bungie eventually added random masterworks towards the end of the year, and this was probably the closest thing to random rolls that we had in 2017. This was kind of a failure though, because you could just spend resources to masterwork a weapon or change its stat bonus, meaning that all weapon drops were still functionally identical. You also had to choose between a Vanguard or Crucible tracker on your masterwork, making it a huge hassle to switch between them. Interestingly, Bungie never changed how these old masterworks function, and you can still pull them from collections today. Even though the description still says that it will generate orbs, that functionality was removed with Witch Queen and no longer works. Similar to weapons, armor was as basic as it has ever been during this period. Bungie removed the discipline, intellect, and strength stats that existed in Destiny 1, and instead we only had mobility, resilience, and recovery. These armor pieces also didn't have random rolls, but different armor sets would provide certain stat bonuses. Each armor piece then had 2 options to adjust your stat points depending on your preferences, and you guessed it, these were also predetermined and not random. Depending on your class, you would have different options in each slot, so for example, Hunter Gauntlets always had a choice between mobility and recovery. Armor Masterworks did not come until 2018, but armor could at least equip mods that actually did something. There were 3 main types of armor mods. Some adjusted your ability cooldowns, others provided weapon bonuses, and lastly, there were also some stat boosting mods for your basic mobility, resilience, and recovery. There were some very strange limitations with this system though. For example, mobility-related mods could only be slotted in your gauntlets or on a hunter's cloak. Another strange one was that leg armor could only equip recovery boosting mods or some subclass ability boosters. There was only 1 mod slot per armor piece, and overall, the build crafting potential was just a tiny fraction of what we know today. Armor completely lacked depth and complexity, and just like weapons, all of the armor pieces really felt the same. All you needed to do was acquire an armor piece for every slot, equip a basic mod, and then congratulations, you just automatically had the best loadout and you had effectively completed the armor loot chase. There was simply no reason to get any additional armor, and no progression on the armor that you already had. One system that was notably missing during vanilla was the entire collection screen. Even if you opened up your wallet and bought a fancy new ship on the Eververse store, there was no way to make a copy of it, so you could only use it on one character at a time. Not to mention, almost everything in 2017 was put inside of the microtransaction store, meaning that Eververse was basically the only way to get a legendary ship or sparrow. Many players saw this as a move to increase monetization and extract even more money, so it was certainly not a popular change. Another topic people were concerned about was the extremely restrictive subclass trees that had almost 0 customization, and they are almost completely unrecognizable compared to the 3.0 system we have today. Your only options were to change your grenade, class ability, and jump, and then you just had to pick one of these 2 trees. These would often have some small changes to your super and provide some small buffs to your subclass. Once you had picked a tree though, that was the end of the customization. This didn't feel great considering that Destiny 1 had quite a few options and things that we could adjust, and it would take Bungie literal years before they finally removed this awful system. One of the most despised things from 2017 was the dreaded new token system. Instead of dropping loot, activities just dropped tokens, which then had to be turned in at vendors. When you turned in tokens, it was basically like a slot machine. You spent tokens and then you got something random. And then it was probably worthless because it was probably something that you already had. This was just one of the many issues making loot feel bad, meaningless, and unexciting in the early days. Needless to say, PvP has always been a hotly debated topic, and 2017 was no exception. Back then, your game mode options were insanely limited because you could only pick between quick play and competitive. Both of these playlists were exclusively 4v4, and fan-favorite modes like Rumble and 6v6 were completely absent. The 2 playlists would both randomly select from the game modes, being Clash, Survival, Countdown, Supremacy, and Control. There were no ranks in competitive and no special rewards, so it was basically just a sweatier version of quick play with more lag and longer matchmaking times. This was not exactly a winner. The gameplay itself was hilariously slow with regard to your abilities, your movement, and even your weapons. Abilities did low damage and took centuries to regenerate, most primaries took like a full second to eliminate a guardian, and the movement was so slow that the meta basically involved camping together in one spot with all of your teammates. With no special ammo to increase the pace and shake things up, it was basically just endless primary team shooting with little to no variation. On the weekend, instead of Trials of Osiris, we had Trials of the Nine. This was also a 4v4 mode where matches could either be survival or countdown, and at the start of every match, you would be greeted by this insanely long loading screen demonstrating every single player's loadout and their emotes. Loadouts were locked, and each team had limited revives. Unlike Trials of Osiris, you didn't have different card modifiers like the Passage of Mercy. You just straight up needed 7 wins in a row if you wanted to go flawless. Afterwards, you could go up to this social space and climb the Spire. There were multiple different platforms surrounding it, and the more wins you had, the further you could climb to earn additional loot. Ultimately, the mode wasn't very popular, and Bungie ended up removing Trials of the Nine when Forsaken released, leaving the game without any form of trials for multiple years. Another way that the Crucible was downgraded was the complete removal of private matches. This was an extremely popular feature from Destiny 1 where players could experiment with loadouts and play against their friends, so many people were very disappointed to see it not carry over to Destiny 2. Quite a lot has changed on the PvE side of things since 2017. There has been a tremendous amount of content that has been added to the game since it came out, but there has also been a lot of content that was actually removed. Like, it's kind of insane, but the director might have looked sort of like this if Bungie had never removed any content. One of the most notable things they removed was the original Red War campaign that defined the 2017 Destiny experience. This campaign was very well received when people first played through it. For the first time, it felt like the campaign had a truly coherent narrative that took a darker tone and told a story about all Guardians losing their light. With Gaul, Destiny finally had a villain with some depth that could be explored within the game without having to dive into hidden lore books. And by the way, the in-game lore was very limited at this time. The campaign had some great cutscenes as well as longer missions that felt much more immersive than ones from Destiny's past. Where this campaign differs from modern campaigns, however, is the optional legendary difficulty that was introduced with the Witch Queen. Without the harder difficulty option, the Red War was generally considered very easy, and the Gaul fight was disappointing as he had basically no health. Modern boss fights are also much more involved, with Savathun in particular being very long, with multiple phases and even narrative beats within the fight. Ultimately, the Red War campaign was a step forward for Destiny, and it's a shame that it was removed when the Content Vault was added. This campaign was a key part of the 2017 experience for players, and many believe that its removal did some real harm by making it much more difficult to introduce new players to the game. A few weeks after Destiny 2 launched, there was genuine concern about the lack of endgame content. Nightfalls were one of the only endgame activities that did exist, and they were not very popular at all. They didn't feel great, partly because of the new weapon system, but there were also a number of changes specifically to Nightfalls that made them feel like a chore to play. First of all, Bungie added a Nightfall timer which would send the team to orbit if they failed to complete the strike on time. Considering how hard it was to take down enemies with double primaries, people didn't appreciate having to rush ahead in order to avoid losing their entire run because of the timer. There were also a number of modifiers that made the Nightfalls even more painful. Prism was one modifier that would cause the burn of the Nightfall to change every 30 seconds, meaning that incoming and outgoing damage would be constantly shifting all the time. These modifiers were also extra painful when playing on the prestige difficulty of the Nightfall. This version would lock players' loadouts, so it was very important to make sure that you had all of your elemental types across all 3 players. You also had to be very careful about which weapons you were using in order to avoid running out of ammo. On top of all of this, the rewards were really not great. There was no Nightfall or strike-specific loot at all, and the only rewards you would get were some engrams, tokens, and the Nightfall aura that would wear off after the next reset. Nightfalls were simply painful to play and not rewarding to complete, making them very unpopular in the overall community. Like I mentioned earlier, the Nightfall was one of the only endgame activities when Destiny 2 released, but there were a few other pursuits after the campaign ended. These were really cool at first, and players were very happy to have so much content to play through. A whole new sequel game filled with new events, quests, and objectives did definitely lead to a honeymoon period where people were very satisfied. However, the main problem with most of these activities is that they would get very boring after just a few playthroughs. For example, Lost Sectors were first introduced at launch, but they were much simpler than what we have today. You can still go through and play some of the original Lost Sectors on the original planets, but over the years, Bungie has done a lot of work to improve these. In the modern game, they are much more involved with large winding environments, selectable difficulties, and the added incentive of legendary and exotic gear. The old Lost Sectors from 2017, however, were generally quite small, and they took maybe a couple minutes to complete. They were pitched as this innovative system that would give Destiny 2 all of this new depth, but sadly, they just didn't really accomplish that goal in 2017. After the campaign ended, you could also run through the world quests in order to unlock some legendaries and exotic loot. These were pretty simple and would also tell you the background story of each planetary destination. There were also these adventure side quests, which were completely absent from Destiny 2 for years until they finally returned in the final shape. These were short and easy story missions that would go into more depth about different characters and events as they were happening in the world. One of the primary sources of powerful gear was the Flashpoint events. These would rotate between the different destinations and would require you to spend a lot of time completing a mix of public events, lost sectors, and heroic versions of the adventures. Cade 6 would also sell treasure maps that would guide you to hidden chests on the Flashpoint destination where you could get some extra loot. Looking back, it's kind of crazy to think about, but these boring activities like Flashpoints, world quests, lost sectors, and public events were really the extent of the Destiny 2 endgame. Personally, I don't consider any of these to be real endgame activities, but the fact that these were the core focus of the game just goes to show how bare bones Destiny really was in 2017. It is simply not fun to go through the same exact lost sector or public event for the 100th time in order to get a couple of tokens. It's hilarious to think about in retrospect, but Bungie actually thought that public events were one of the best and most exciting activities in the entire game. There is even this quote from an interview where they are hyping up public events.
We realized that public events are one of the most exciting pieces of content that we have, especially with the heroic events and a couple of other things that we're not even talking about yet.
The one true piece of endgame content from 2017 was the Leviathan raid. This brought one of the more unique raiding experiences, as well as an absolutely massive environment for Guardians to explore. The raid was built around a central hub where you had to unlock doors to access each of the 3 encounters. The order that these encounters needed to be completed would also rotate from week to week. In addition, there was also a labyrinth within the Leviathan underbelly where you could move between encounters without having to return and clear out the main area once again. In here, there were a bunch of hidden keys and chests that could be found to unlock more loot. Once each of these encounters were completed, you could then access Callus's throne room where you would take on one of the many animatronics made in his image. The raid definitely had a different vibe than many of the ones that came before it. Part of this was due to the weapon system, because this is one of the only times in Destiny history where dealing damage with a primary weapon against a boss was actually a viable strategy. It was by far the best endgame experience during 2017, and yet it still wasn't considered to be as good as most of the raids from Destiny 1. Outside of the main systems and game modes, there were several other things to note about this time period in Destiny history. The farm was a social space that was hyped up to be the replacement of the original tower, which was of course destroyed as a part of the game's opening narrative. The farm did end up being pretty cool, and as you can see here, there were a few things that you could do and explore during your visit, but ultimately it was barely used after the campaign. Shaders were extremely problematic around this time, and they proved to be a point of contention and annoyance for years. While the ability to equip different shaders on individual pieces of armor was a nice improvement over Destiny 1, shaders also became consumable items in Destiny 2. The idea was to make you run activities over and over again in order to get enough shaders for all of your items. Some of the most popular shaders, however, like Soros Modular Shine and Metro Shift, were locked behind the Eververse store. Due to the random nature of the Eververse engrams, many players also thought that the consumable shaders encouraged more microtransactions and additional spending. To make matters worse, shaders were also stored in part of your inventory similar to mods, and therefore it could overflow into your postmaster and cause major issues. It was a painful and slow process to individually dismantle your shaders, and as a whole, the inventory management situation was an absolute disaster at this time. Some players even had to resort to storing shaders in their vaults in order to maintain a collection. The community was very upset about this, and one of the most popular Reddit posts from the time was titled, "Do not spend a single cent on microtransactions until shaders become unlimited use." This is one of the most popular Destiny Reddit posts of all time, and with over 45,000 upvotes, it's clear that essentially everybody was unhappy with shaders. While the Eververse store is mostly accepted as a standard practice in the game today, there was an incredible amount of controversy around it when Destiny 2 launched. A big reason for this was that much of the loot that was traditionally earnable in-game was instead being locked behind microtransactions and real money. There were dozens of items like ships, sparrows, ghost shells, and shaders that were all for sale, but at the time, the endgame activities like the raid did not have a single ship or sparrow associated with them. The community then became even more upset when we learned that Bungie was throttling XP gains, making it nearly impossible to farm for bright engrams. There was a period where players completely flooded the forums with the hashtag #RemoveEververse to stage a protest against Bungie's monetization practices. Despite being a core feature in Destiny 1, D2 actually did not have bounties for its first year. Instead, the game featured these things called challenges. Not to be confused with the modern seasonal challenges, these were kind of similar and involved completing objectives in an activity or destination. You had 3 challenges per day that needed to be completed, and once you were done, you could go claim your loot from the Vanguard members. These were very different from bounties because there was no way to purchase them, exchange them, or repeat them in any way. You just got 3 challenges, and then you were done and had to wait until the next day for them to refresh. Faction rallies were introduced in Destiny 2 and then were quickly abandoned. These were limited time events where you would pledge allegiance to one of the 3 factions that existed at the time, and you had to complete activities on their behalf. When you did this, you would receive tokens, so basically this just ended up being another glorified token farming simulator. Each faction would have a weapon that would only become obtainable if they managed to win the event. If your faction won, you would get a discount and it would only cost 1,000 glimmer to buy the reward. For members of opposing factions though, it would cost a massive 50,000 glimmer, which was literally half of the glimmer cap that existed at the time. The rewards from the 2 losing factions would simply disappear forever. In retrospect, this seems a tad wasteful as far as development time goes, and ultimately these rallies did not last for long. Factions were kind of an important part of the game in D1, but in D2 they were rapidly abandoned and became almost entirely meaningless. Eventually, Bungie would remove them all from the tower during the Season of the Splicers narrative, putting an end to people asking for faction rallies to return. Despite some of the difficulties surrounding the game's launch, there were also some pleasant surprises. The EDZ destination that was originally teased way back in 2013 was finally introduced to the game, and it turned out to be the largest destination of all time. Featuring plenty of new environments across tons of different loading zones, this was an area that was deservingly applauded. Although the art style itself is up for debate, another improvement was the overall graphical fidelity in Destiny 2. Bungie clearly stepped it up a bit and made the overall game look a little bit better than Destiny 1. There are a number of other systems that we enjoy in the game today, and we almost take them for granted, but they did not exist back in 2017. Fireteam Finder is a relatively new addition to Destiny which replaced the guided games feature that sat largely unused since Destiny's launch. Guided games was meant to be a way for clans to take solo players through raids and nightfalls, and while Bungie originally offered some limited emblems for using this feature, they eventually stopped issuing them entirely. This whole guided games feature was hyped up as being this great new innovative thing when Destiny 2 launched, but unfortunately, nobody actually used it. Many settings like high sensitivity, dead zones, custom button mapping, full auto, and countless others were also simply not there in 2017. Cross-save was also non-existent. This was quite unfortunate because the PC version of the game released a month and a half after the console version, making the PC players either wait to start playing or buy the game twice and restart with a new account. Some players were extra upset because the game did feature some veteran emblems and dialogue for Destiny 1 players, but it was impossible to get any of that on PC at the time. 2 years later, cross-save would be introduced and allow many console players to finally make the jump to PC. However, cross-play wouldn't be introduced for another 2 years after that, so suffice it to say, it was a lot more difficult to play with your friends during 2017. Despite insane initial interest in the game, the player base saw a steep decline throughout the rest of the year, as you can see on this graph. As 2017 came to a close and we headed into the infamous Curse of Osiris expansion, the entire Destiny franchise was just a few weeks away from meeting its end. When you take a high-level view of this entire period from 2017, the launch of Destiny 2 definitely had its strengths and weaknesses. It got some big things right, like the addition of PC, the mantling system, the graphical improvements, and the campaign. But in other areas like the shaders, the subclass trees, and the disastrous double primary idea, it also got a lot of things wrong. It almost felt like an underdeveloped prequel instead of a sequel, and many frustrated players left the franchise forever. If you compare the massive differences between D1, the original D2 launch, and then finally the modern game, it is wild how much has changed over the last decade. If you want to see the complete journey of this game's history, you're gonna love this video covering the entire evolution of the Destiny franchise starting all the way back in 2007. Go ahead and click that video now, and thank you so much for watching.